There is a number that the mainstream financial press has reported accurately but has not explained clearly. $3 billion. Every single day between October 2025 and April 2026, the United States Treasury paid $3 billion in net interest on its existing debt. Not new programs, not new spending, not defense, not Social Security, not Medicare, just the cost of maintaining the obligations that already existed before a single new dollar was committed. In the 7 months from October to April, the total reached $628 billion. That is more than the federal government spent on Medicare in the same period, more than Medicaid. The interest payments on debt are now a larger budget line than either of the two largest healthcare programs in the country. The Congressional Budget Office projects that net interest payments will cross $1 trillion for the full fiscal year 2026. The first time in American history that number has been reached. And here is the detail that most commentary misses entirely. This is not a consequence of reckless new spending. It is a consequence of the compounding arithmetic of a debt base that has grown too large to be managed by normal fiscal tools. The debt is now self-generating. The interest creates new borrowing needs. The new borrowing creates more interest. The cycle is now structural, not cyclical. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget identified the inflection point in February. Under the CBO's current 10-year baseline later in this decade, the average interest rate on all federal debt will exceed nominal economic growth. That is not a projection of difficulty. It is the mathematical definition of a debt spiral. It has started. This is Capital Briefing. If you're here for the first time, subscribe now before we go further. Turn on notifications. What we build on this channel is the translation of what institutional capital is doing before the public narrative catches up. The gap between when structural shifts begin and when they become mainstream headlines is exactly where the most consequential positioning decisions get made. Subscribe now. Then let me show you what the debt spiral actually means and what it means for every asset class you currently hold. Before I explain the mechanism, I want to establish something. This video is not about politics. It is not about which party is responsible. The data does not support a political explanation. Both major American political parties have contributed to this trajectory. The CBO projects that, under current law, including the effects of the 2025 Reconciliation Act signed by the current administration, the deficit over the next decade will be $23 trillion larger than revenue. That is a structural condition, not a partisan one. What I am concerned with is the mechanism. What happens to asset prices, to interest rates, to the dollar, to gold, and to the global financial system when the largest sovereign borrower in the history of the world reaches the point where its debt is structurally self-sustaining? Let me begin with the most precise data available as of this week. The U.S. national debt stands at approximately $39 trillion. Of that, debt held by the public, the portion actually financed in credit markets, is $31.27 trillion. As of March 31, 2026, that figure exceeded the US GDP of $31.22 trillion. Debt held by the public is now above 100% of GDP for the first time since the final years of World War II. The Office of Management and Budget projects the fiscal year 2026 deficit at $2.06 trillion. That is $166 billion in new debt every month, $88 billion in interest payments alone every month. The CBO's projection for the same year is $1.9 trillion, somewhat more conservative. Both numbers represent deficits of approximately 6% of GDP, nearly double the long-run average of 3.8%. The fiscal year ends September 30th. The OMB then projects FY 2027 to run at a deficit of $2.17 trillion, $181 billion per month. That is the baseline, not a crisis scenario, the projected baseline. Now let me explain what makes this different from every previous period of elevated American debt. The United States has carried high debt before. After World War II, debt held by the public reached 106% of GDP, slightly above where it is today. What made that debt manageable was a specific combination of conditions that no longer exist. First, interest rates were extremely low. The Federal Reserve maintained near zero rates throughout the war and for years after, suppressing the cost of carrying the debt. Second, the economy grew rapidly in the post-war expansion, reducing the debt-to-GDP ratio through growth rather than repayment. Third, the debt was largely domestically held, meaning interest payments recycled through the American economy rather than flowing abroad. None of these three conditions apply today. The federal funds rate is between 3.5 and 3.75%. 30-year Treasury yields recently climbed back toward 5%. The CBO project's net interest outlays will grow from $1 trillion in 2026 to $2.1 trillion by 2036, a 106% increase in a single decade. That growth is not a function of new spending decisions. It is the mechanical consequence of refinancing maturing debt at current rates and issuing new debt to cover ongoing deficits. What makes the current moment structurally different from all previous episodes of elevated American debt is this. The interest payments are now themselves one of the primary drivers of new deficit creation. The government collects revenue. It pays its mandatory obligations. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits. It pays for defense. It pays for discretionary programs. And then it pays interest. In fiscal year 2026, interest alone accounts for approximately 22% of all federal tax revenue. $1 in 5 of every tax dollar collected goes directly to the holders of US Treasury securities before a single government function is performed. That is the debt spiral in numerical form. Subscribe to Capital Briefing if this framing is delivering the structural clarity you have been looking for. Turn on notifications. The next video examines the specific mechanisms through which a debt spiral at the sovereign level transmits to the assets most retail investors currently hold. What happens to equities, to bonds, to real estate, and to gold as the arithmetic of sovereign debt refinancing creates structural pressure on every other asset class simultaneously. Subscribe now. Then let me take you to the concept that connects this fiscal analysis to the geopolitical reality that is reshaping the global order right now. In February 2025, Sir Niall Ferguson, the economic historian at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, published a working paper that introduced what he called Ferguson's Law. The formulation is precise. Any great power that spends more on debt servicing than on defense risks ceasing to be a great power. The logic behind it is historical and structural. When a state's interest obligations consume more resources than its security apparatus, two things happen simultaneously. The state loses the fiscal flexibility to maintain and modernize its military, and the creditors who hold that state's debt gain structural leverage over its fiscal decisions because any threat to default affects their holdings, not just the state's reputation. The historical examples Ferguson cites are not obscure. Habsburg Spain in the late 16th century, overextended through debt, unable to equip its armies, ultimately ceding dominance. The Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, spending more than 50% of annual revenue on debt service, eventually subjected to foreign control of its finances. Post-World War I Britain, interest payments soaring to 7.5% of GDP against 2.4% on defense, the fiscal constraints that drove appeasement, the near-fatal delay in rearmament. These are not coincidences, they are a pattern. The United States crossed the Ferguson limit in 2024. For the first time since 1934, nearly a century, American interest payments on the national debt exceeded defense spending. That threshold has now been maintained for 2 consecutive years. The CBO does not project the United States returning to the right side of that line. Under its current baseline, interest costs grow to $2.1 trillion by 2036. Defense spending, even under the most aggressive proposals currently being discussed, does not approach that number. This is not a warning that the United States is about to collapse. Historical analysis does not support catastrophism. Britain violated Ferguson's law multiple times and remained a significant power. What history does support is this: states that sustain debt service obligations above defense spending for extended periods lose the capacity to project power, lose credibility with creditors, and eventually face either inflation, default, or some combination of both. All three of those outcomes have direct consequences for every asset class. Let me now connect the fiscal arithmetic to what it means for the Federal Reserve, because this is where the debt spiral becomes most directly relevant to investors. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate: price stability and maximum employment. In practice, its primary tool is the federal funds rate. When inflation runs above target, the Fed raises rates to cool the economy. When economic growth slows, it cuts rates to stimulate. This mechanism depends on one critical assumption: that the Fed can raise rates without creating a fiscal crisis. That assumption is now compromised. At $39 trillion in debt, a 1 percentage point increase in the average interest rate on all federal debt adds approximately $390 billion annually to the interest burden. A 2 percentage point increase adds nearly $800 billion. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget calculated that if interest rates run just 1 percentage point above the CBO's current projections, bringing the 10-year Treasury yield from an average 4.3% to 5.3% over the decade, it would add an additional $3.5 trillion to the debt above current projections. Deutsche Bank analysts described the current conditions in a note as a fiscal dominance regime, a state in which the Fed's ability to aggressively raise rates to control inflation is constrained by the risk of triggering a fiscal or financial crisis. They observed that such an environment tends to produce higher for longer inflation, as the central bank is structurally incentivized to tolerate elevated price levels rather than raise rates to the level necessary to control them. Jerome Powell himself described the debt trajectory as unsustainable. That was not an academic observation. It was a signal that the Fed is operating in a constrained environment. This is the trap. Inflation remains above target. The rate needed to bring inflation fully under control, under conventional Taylor rule analysis, is higher than the current rate. But the fiscal arithmetic of $39 trillion in debt makes aggressive tightening existentially dangerous for the government's financing capacity. The Fed is caught between its inflation mandate and the fiscal sustainability of the sovereign it is nominally independent from. Every major financial crisis in the past century has involved this dynamic in some form, a period of extended monetary accommodation driven not by economic conditions but by the fiscal needs of the government. The mechanism of transmission to asset prices is always the same. Elevated inflation erodes real returns on cash and fixed income, driving capital into real assets, while the eventual reckoning when the fiscal adjustment can no longer be deferred creates the most acute market stress. This is not a prediction of when, it is an identification of the structural conditions that are now in place. Now let me address the variable that smart money is watching most carefully in this environment, and that most retail portfolios are entirely unprepared for. When a sovereign debt spiral reaches the point where normal fiscal adjustment is structurally blocked, when the Fed cannot raise rates sufficiently to control inflation without destabilizing the government's financing, the historical repertoire of responses is limited. The first option is growth. If the economy grows faster than the interest rate, the debt-to-GDP ratio stabilizes over time. The CBO's current baseline assumes this does not happen in this decade. Under its projections, debt held by the public rises from 101% of GDP today to 120% by 2036, surpassing the previous post-war record. The second option is fiscal consolidation. Spending cuts and revenue increases sufficient to close the primary deficit. The OMB projects a primary deficit of 2.6% of GDP this year. Closing that gap would require approximately $850 billion in annual fiscal adjustment. No current legislative proposal approaches that scale. The third option is financial repression, the mechanism by which governments historically navigate debt burdens that cannot be managed through normal fiscal tools. Financial repression involves maintaining interest rates below the rate of inflation, effectively transferring wealth from creditors to debtors. In this scenario, The holder of US Treasury bonds earns a nominal return, but a negative real return. Their purchasing power declines even as their nominal balance grows. The real value of the debt is inflated away. This is the scenario that smart money is pricing into its gold allocation. Central banks purchased 244 tons of gold in Q1 2026 alone, responding not to a specific crisis event, but to a structural reassessment of the risk profile of dollar-denominated reserve assets in an environment of fiscal dominance. When the largest borrower in the world cannot afford to let interest rates rise to levels that would actually control inflation, the holders of that borrower's obligations face a structural negative real return environment. Gold does not pay interest. It does not generate yield. But in an environment where the relevant alternative, holding dollar-denominated sovereign debt, systematically loses purchasing power through financial repression, the opportunity cost calculation changes. This is the calculation that 244 tons of Q1 central bank purchases reflects. Let me close with the framing that I believe is most important for anyone watching this right now. A debt spiral is not a dramatic event. It does not announce itself with a market crash or a currency crisis. It announces itself through gradual, almost imperceptible changes in fiscal arithmetic, rising interest to revenue ratios, declining fiscal space, constrained monetary policy, and the slow erosion of the real value of savings and fixed income holdings. The dramatic events, when they occur, are not the spiral itself. They are the market's eventual repricing of the conditions that the spiral has created over years or decades. We are in the gradual phase. The numbers are public. The arithmetic is not disputed. The CBO's own projections confirm the trajectory. Jerome Powell has used the word unsustainable. Jamie Dimon has warned of a bond crisis. Ray Dalio has described an economic heart attack in formation. $3 billion every day in interest payments, $1 trillion in annual interest costs for the first time in history. Debt above GDP for the first time since the final years of World War II. Ferguson's law violated for the second consecutive year. These are not separate stories. They are the same story. The story of a system that has reached the point where it can no longer afford itself through normal means. The question is not whether the adjustment comes. The question is whether you are positioned for the form it takes. Subscribe to Capital Briefing now if this video changed what you understand about the structural trajectory of American fiscal conditions. Turn on notifications. Leave one comment, one word if you prefer. When you look at your current portfolio, what percentage of it is positioned for the adjustment that the arithmetic of $39 trillion in debt at these rates demands? The debt spiral has started. Most people will not notice until it is too late to reposition.